Let me ask you something. Have you ever sat in a room full of your own family? People you shared holidays with, people you cried with at funerals, people you called when your heart was breaking, and realized in one single shattering moment that you didn't know any of them at all? Because that's exactly what happened to me. And the worst part, it happened on the same day we buried my father. The same day the ground was still fresh above his grave. The same day my mother's hands were still shaking from holding the casket flowers. The same day my little sister Emma was crying so hard she could barely breathe. That was the day my brother Richard looked me dead in the eyes across our father's kitchen table, slid a folder toward me, and said, "And I will never, never forget these words for as long as I live. Daddy wanted it this way, Sarah. I'm sorry, but the decision has already been made." I didn't understand what he meant. Not then, but by the time I figured it out, everything was already gone. The house, the savings, 32 years of my parents' life together, all of it, transferred, signed away, and locked behind a gate I wasn't allowed to enter. And here's the thing about my brother Richard. He was so good at lying, so smooth, so calculated. He'd been doing it his whole life, just in smaller doses. Little lies here, small manipulations there. The kind you brush off because you love someone and you want to believe the best about them. But this time, Richard hadn't told a small lie. This time, he'd built an entire cathedral of deception, and our family was trapped inside it. What he didn't know, what none of us knew, was that our father had spent the last months of his life quietly building a door. And that door had our names on it. This is the story of how my family tried to destroy me, and how the truth came back to destroy them instead. Stay with me, because you are going to want to hear every single word of this. Title card. The will, soft, dramatic underscore begins. ACT1, the last summer. My father's name was Thomas Mitchell. And if you'd met him, you would have liked him immediately. That was the thing about Dad, he had this warmth that filled a room before he even said a word. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's coffee order, who fixed his neighbor's fence without being asked, who still called my mother beautiful on their 32nd anniversary, loud enough for the restaurant to hear, and meant every syllable. He was 64 years old when the first chest pain hit. It was a Tuesday in July. He was mowing the back lawn. He always insisted on doing it himself, even after we begged him to hire someone, when he felt what he described as a hand pressing hard against his sternum. He sat down on the garden steps, waited for it to pass, and then went inside and made himself a sandwich. He didn't call any of us. He didn't go to the hospital. He just made a sandwich. That was Dad. My mother found out 2 days later when she was filing some paperwork and discovered a prescription he'd picked up quietly. She called me immediately, and I drove the 40 minutes to their house in Claremont Hill with my heart in my throat the entire way. By the time I got there, Dad was sitting in his armchair with a cup of tea, looking exactly like himself, and somehow that made it worse. "It's nothing, sweetheart," he said. It wasn't nothing. The doctors told us that summer that Thomas Mitchell had a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle that had apparently been developing for years. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, they said. With medication, lifestyle changes, regular monitoring, he could live comfortably for years. We exhaled. We adjusted. We reorganized our lives around Tuesday checkups and Friday phone calls, and a shared family calendar that all three of us kids were supposed to fill in, so there was always someone nearby. I say all three of us kids. That means me, Sarah, the middle child. My older brother, Richard, who at 41 was already running a mid-size property investment firm out of the city. And my little sister, Emma, 26 at the time, sweet and quiet, and still trying to find herself between two waitressing jobs and a pottery class she loved more than anything in the world. We were not a perfect family. No family is. But we were ours. And for a little while that summer, driving out to Claremont Hill on weekends, sitting on the back porch with Dad while he told stories about his early days working construction, while Mom brought out lemonade and pretended not to fuss. For a little while, it felt like we were pulling together in a way we hadn't in years. Richard even came out twice, which, for Richard, was unusual. Richard was always busy. Richard always had a deal closing, a client to meet, a flight to catch. Richard's wife, Karen, was the same polished, professional, perpetually dressed like she was heading to a board meeting. She was pleasant enough on the surface. Perfectly pleasant, in fact. That was always the word that came to mind with Karen. Pleasant. Like a room that's been professionally staged. Nice to look at, nothing real in it. I didn't dislike Karen, not then. I just never felt like I knew her. I didn't know that not knowing her was actually protecting me. Dad passed away on the 14th of October. Not from his heart condition, or not directly. He'd gone to the hospital for a routine procedure to regulate an irregular heartbeat, a procedure his cardiologist said was low risk. Standard. Something they did every day. He went under. He didn't come back. There was a blood clot. Unexpected, they said. Unpredictable. He was 64 years old. He was supposed to have years. I got the call at 6:47 in the morning. My husband David was still sleeping. I walked out to the back garden in my pajamas, sat down in the wet grass, and didn't make a single sound. I just sat there and breathed until I remembered how. Then I called Emma. Then I called Richard. And then I called my mother, who had already been there when it happened, and who said my name in a voice I had never heard from her before, a voice that was completely empty, like someone had reached in and taken out everything that made it hers. "He's gone, Sarah," she said. "I know, Mom," I said. "He's gone," she said again. And I understood then that she wasn't telling me new information. She was just saying it out loud, over and over, because she couldn't yet believe it herself. ACT too, the funeral and the folder. The funeral was on a Saturday, 10 days after he died. The church was full, more full than any of us expected, honestly. People came from his old construction company. People came from the neighborhood. A man drove 4 hours from where they'd grown up because he said Thomas Mitchell had lent him money 30 years ago when he had nothing, and he'd never forgotten. My mother sat in the front pew, wearing the navy dress Dad had always said made her eyes look like the sea on a clear day. Emma cried the entire service. She held my hand so tight my fingers went numb, and I didn't say a word about it. Richard sat straight-backed and dry-eyed, which in itself wasn't strange for Richard. He processed things differently. Privately, I understood that. What I noticed, and I remember this now with such uncomfortable clarity, was that Richard kept glancing at his phone under the pew. And twice during the reception, he and Karen stepped outside together and came back looking like they'd resolved something. I noticed. I filed it away somewhere in the back of my mind. I was too deep in grief to examine it. That was my first mistake. 3 days after the funeral, Richard asked us all to meet at the family house. "For the practical matters," he said on the group chat he'd set up. "We need to address things while they're fresh, for Mom's sake." I agreed. Of course I agreed. I thought he was being responsible. I thought he was stepping up, the way older siblings sometimes do in a crisis. Emma and I arrived together. David stayed home with our daughter Lily. Mom was already in the kitchen, looking small in a way I'd never associated with her before. She'd always been such a composed woman. Strong. But grief had taken something from her posture, like someone had removed a rod from her spine. Richard and Karen were already there. And there was a man I didn't recognize sitting at the kitchen table with a briefcase. "This is Gerald Marsh," Richard said. "He's a legal consultant. He's here to help us understand Dad's estate." I blinked. "What?" "Sit down, Sarah," Karen said, and she gestured at the chair like she was hosting a business meeting, like it was her kitchen. Something tightened in my chest. "Who is this person?" I asked again. Calmly, "Where's Dad's actual lawyer? Martin Hayes has handled Dad's affairs for 20 years. Why isn't he here? Richard smiled. It was the kind of smile that wasn't actually a smile. Martin Hayes was removed from the account 6 months ago, he said. Dad updated his legal representation. Gerald here helped facilitate the updated estate documents. Updated estate documents, I repeated. Yes. Without telling any of us. Dad wasn't obligated to disclose that to anyone, Sarah. It's his estate. Emma was looking between us like she was watching a tennis match she didn't understand. Gerald Marsh cleared his throat and opened his briefcase. He slid a document across the table. I looked down at it. It was a will, dated 8 weeks before my father died. And according to this will, Richard Mitchell was the sole beneficiary and executor of Thomas Mitchell's entire estate. The house, the savings account containing what I would later learn was just under $400,000, the investment portfolio, the family land up in the valley that had been in our family since my grandfather's time. Everything. To Richard. Alone. A provision was included, one single provision, that reasonable accommodation be made for the surviving spouse, Margaret Mitchell, for a period of up to 24 months, after which point the primary residence would revert to the estate. In other words, my mother had 24 months to grieve before she had to leave her own home. I read it twice. Then I put it down on the table very carefully, because my hands were shaking and I didn't want anyone to see. This isn't real, I said. Sarah, this is not Dad's will. I need you to tell me right now that this is some kind of mistake, because Dad would never write Emma and me out completely. He would never put Mom on a clock in her own house. He would never. Dad changed his mind, Richard said, and his voice was utterly, artificially calm. He spoke to me at length about it. He felt that given my financial expertise and my professional background, it made the most sense for me to manage the family assets. He trusted me to look after Mom, to look after all of you. Then why didn't he tell us? He didn't want to cause conflict. Conflict, I said flatly. He loved you, Sarah. He just trusted me with the money. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom, I said gently, did you know about this? She was quiet for a long moment. Your father discussed it with me, she finally said. Her voice was barely a thread. He felt it was best. Something cold moved through me like a wave. ACT3, the cracks begin to show. I drove home that night in complete silence. David kept glancing at me from the passenger seat. I'd called him, and he'd come to pick me up because I didn't trust myself to drive, and he knew better than to speak. When we got home and Lily was in bed and the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table, and I went through everything I could remember. The new lawyer, Gerald Marsh, never mentioned. The will dated 8 weeks before Dad died, during the period when he was on new medications, when he was stressed and frightened, when he was alone for parts of the day because Mom had been going to her own checkups. Richard's 2 visits that summer, which, at the time, I'd been touched by. Karen and Richard stepping outside at the funeral reception. The document, every single asset, to Richard, alone. I got out a notepad. I started writing. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions or invents conspiracies. I'm an accountant, actually, or I was at the time, working for a small firm downtown. I am, by training and by temperament, someone who follows the numbers. And the numbers here did not add up. I called Martin Hayes the next morning. Martin Hayes, my father's lawyer for 20 years, the man who had drafted my parents' original will jointly, who had been at their dinner table more than once over the years, who had sent my parents a card on every anniversary. He answered on the second ring. Sarah, he said, and his voice already carried something I couldn't quite name. I wondered if you'd call. Martin, I said, when exactly were you removed from Dad's account? He was quiet for a moment. May 15th, about 5 months before your father passed. Did my father call you personally to make that change? Another pause, longer this time. I received a written notice, he said carefully. Your father's signature was on it, but Sarah, I want to be honest with you. I tried to call Thomas directly after I received it because it felt abrupt, out of character. We had a relationship. I expected at minimum a conversation. And he didn't return my calls, which was unusual. And when I tried again a week later, Richard answered the phone and told me that his father had made his wishes clear and that I should direct any further communication through the new legal representative. My jaw tightened. Martin, did my father seem like himself to you in the months before he died, when you did speak to him? The pause that followed was the longest yet. The last time I spoke with Thomas directly was in April, Martin said quietly. And honestly, Sarah, he seemed tired, uncertain. He mentioned Richard was helping him sort out some affairs. He seemed almost like he was Martin stopped himself. I don't want to put words to it. I just know that the man I spoke to in April did not sound like the Thomas Mitchell I'd known for 20 years. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat with my notepad, and I wrote one word at the top of the page. Manipulation. I called Emma that afternoon. Emma, who I loved more than almost anything, who still had traces of childhood in her face even at 26, who had cried into my shoulder at the funeral and whispered, I don't know how to do this without him. I said carefully, I need to ask you something and I need you to be really honest with me. Did Dad ever mention changing his will? Emma was quiet for a moment. No, she said, never. Did Richard ever talk to you about Dad's estate at any point this summer? No, not really. He mentioned once that he was helping Dad with some financial planning stuff, but I figured that was normal. Richard is good with money. Richard is the sole beneficiary. You and I got nothing. A silence opened up between us that lasted a full 10 seconds. What? Emma's voice had gone very small. Nothing, not a single thing. But that's wrong. Dad would never. I know. Sarah, her voice cracked. What's happening? I don't know yet, I said. But I'm going to find out, and I need you to not say anything to Richard or Karen about this conversation. Can you do that? Yes, she said immediately. I mean it, not a word. I promise. I believed her. I shouldn't have. ACT4, digging. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do best. I followed the numbers. I requested copies of my father's financial records, which, as it turned out, was not something Richard could legally prevent me from doing for the period before the estate was formally transferred. I found a probate attorney named Claire Whitmore, a sharp, methodical woman in her 50s who specialized in contested estates, and I told her everything. Claire listened without interrupting. Then she said, Tell me exactly what changed in the 6 months before your father died. And so I laid it out. May, Martin Hayes replaced with Gerald Marsh. No direct communication with my father confirmed. June, a power of attorney form was filed, granting Richard authority to act on my father's behalf in financial matters. My father had signed it, but the signature, when I pulled a copy and compared it to other documents, looked slightly different. Shaky in a way my father's signature never was. My father, even at 64, had the firm, practiced handwriting of a man who'd spent decades signing work contracts. July, 2 of my father's investment accounts were restructured. Funds were moved. A new account was opened in a name I didn't recognize. August, the will was updated. September, my father began a new round of medications after a cardiac event. He was vulnerable. He was scared. October, he died. Claire looked at the timeline for a long time. Sarah, she said carefully, what you're describing, if accurate, is a pattern consistent with undue influence and potentially financial elder abuse. I'd heard those words in the back of my mind for 3 weeks. Hearing them out loud felt like being punched. What do I do? I asked. We contest the will, she said, and simultaneously we pursue a civil action. But Sarah, I want to prepare you. Contesting a will is expensive. It's emotionally brutal. It can tear a family apart in ways that don't heal. And without strong evidence, courts are reluctant to overturn a signed document. I understand. Do you have anyone who can corroborate what you're telling me? Anyone who saw your brother's behavior with your father? Anyone who might have evidence of the relationship dynamic? I thought about it. My father's neighbor, I said slowly. Harold Finch. He and Dad played chess on Wednesday afternoons. He was over there constantly. Claire nodded. Talk to him. And my father's cardiologist, Dr. Reena Patel. She monitored him throughout the summer. If his mental state was compromised by medication, she might have documentation. Good, Claire said. Get me everything. Harold Finch was 72 years old, lived 3 houses down from my parents, and loved my father the way men of a certain generation love their closest friends, without ever saying it out loud, but showing it in 1,000 small, reliable ways. He opened his door the moment he saw me, ushered me into his sitting room, and put the kettle on without asking. When I explained what I was looking into, Harold set his teacup down and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm glad you came, because there are things I've been wanting to say. He told me that in August, about a month before Dad died, he'd been over for their usual Wednesday chess game. Richard had been there, which was unusual. Richard rarely came on weekdays. Richard was on his phone most of the time, Harold said. But at one point, your father and I stepped out onto the back porch for some air, and your father, Harold paused, pressing his lips together. Your dad looked at me and he said, Harry, I feel like I'm losing track of things. And I asked him what he meant. And he said, Richard keeps bringing me papers to sign. I try to read them, but my eyes get tired. I trust him, but sometimes I don't remember everything I've agreed to. My stomach turned over. Did he seem distressed? I asked. He seemed confused, Harold said. And he seemed ashamed of being confused. You know your father, he hated seeming weak. He kept saying, I'm sure it's fine. Richard knows what he's doing. Harold, I said carefully, would you be willing to make a formal statement? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, your father was the best man I've known in 40 years. What I just told you, I'll say to any judge you put in front of me. Dr. Reena Patel was bound by confidentiality in ways that limited what she could share directly. But when I explained the situation and provided my mother's written permission to discuss Thomas Mitchell's care, something I'd had to work very carefully to obtain, because my mother was still, at this point, resistant to the idea that anything was wrong, Dr. Patel agreed to cooperate with the legal process. She couldn't tell me everything, but she told me enough. In the summer months, my father had been on a combination of medications that, in her professional opinion, could have significantly affected his cognitive clarity, his ability to concentrate, his susceptibility to suggestion. She had noted this in her records at the time as a concern and had flagged it to Richard, who was listed as the emergency contact, recommending that major decisions be deferred until Dad's dosage was stabilized. Richard had said he understood. Richard had continued bringing him papers to sign. I called Claire Whitmore with shaking hands. We have enough to file, she said. ACT 5, Richard finds out. I don't know exactly how Richard found out. I'd been investigating. My best guess is Emma. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. Emma was 26 and grieving and probably terrified, and Richard was very good at reading people, at finding the soft places, at pressing. He called me on a Thursday evening, about 5 weeks after the will reading. I was in the kitchen making dinner. David was putting Lily to bed. Richard's name appeared on my phone screen, and I almost didn't answer. Then I decided I should. I know what you're doing, he said the moment I picked up. His voice was different. The smoothness was gone. There was something underneath it now, something harder, colder. I don't know what you mean, I said. Don't play stupid, Sarah. You've been talking to Harold. You've been talking to Martin. You went to see Reena Patel. You've hired a probate attorney. A pause. I know all of it. I set down the spatula I was holding. Then, you know that I have serious concerns about how Dad's will was obtained. Serious concerns, he repeated, and his voice had taken on a quality I can only describe as contemptuous, like the words were something small and annoying he could flick away. Dad chose to leave his estate to me. That's legal. That's documented. And you contesting it is going to cost you a significant amount of money for absolutely nothing. I think we both know it's more than that, Richard. Be careful, he said. I felt something go very still in me. Was that a threat? It's advice from your brother, who is trying to spare you a lot of pain and expense. Another pause. Think about Lily. Think about your family. Is this really how you want to spend the next year of your life, fighting over something that's already been decided? I thought about my father at the kitchen table signing documents with tired eyes and a hand that shook. I thought about Harold Finch saying, I'm sure it's fine. Richard knows what he's doing. I thought about my mother on the morning of the funeral, small and hollow in that navy dress. Richard, I said quietly, if you did what I think you did, and I believe you know exactly what I think you did, then no. This isn't decided, not even close. I hung up. David appeared in the doorway 2 seconds later. Who was that? He asked, reading my face. Richard, I said. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what do you need? That was David. That was always David. Not are you sure? Not maybe let it go. Just what do you need? I need you to know that this is going to get harder before it gets better, I said. Okay, he said simply. He might come after us financially. He has resources I don't. He might make things ugly. I know. I can't promise it won't cost us. David crossed the kitchen, took my face in his hands, and looked at me with the same expression he'd had at our wedding, complete and total certainty. Your dad was a good man, he said, and someone hurt him, so we're going to fix it together. I held it together until he hugged me. And then I cried for about 10 minutes straight. ACT 6, the war BGINS. What happened over the next 2 months was, in retrospect, a systematic campaign. Richard was methodical. I should have expected that. He ran a business. He knew how to strategize. First came my mother. Richard and Karen began spending more time at the family home, taking her to appointments, handling her bills, making themselves indispensable in the way that caregiving can become control without ever quite crossing an obvious line. And they began, slowly and consistently, to reframe me. Mom started calling less frequently. When she did call, she was guarded. She deflected questions about the estate. Once, on a Sunday afternoon, she said to me, Richard says you're trying to make trouble, Sarah. He says it's grief talking. Maybe you should speak to someone. Did you hear that from Richard, or did you think it yourself? I asked. A very long pause. I don't want to take sides, she said finally. Mom, you're not taking sides. You're choosing between what's true and what isn't. I just need everyone to get along right now, she said. I can't handle fighting. Not now. I understood her. I really did. She was grieving. She was vulnerable. She was 70 years old and she had just lost the man she'd built her entire life beside. But Richard knew all of that. And he was using it. Then came my job. I still don't know exactly how Richard did it. I may never know. But 6 weeks after our phone call, my employer received an anonymous complaint suggesting that I had improperly accessed client financial records and shared confidential information. The complaint was detailed, specific. It referenced dates and client names in a way that was designed to sound credible. It was completely fabricated. But it triggered an internal review, and during that review, I was placed on administrative leave. It took 11 days and a full audit to clear my name, 11 days in which I was terrified, humiliated, and barely sleeping. 11 days during which David quietly picked up extra shifts and neither of us mentioned the credit card bills sitting on the kitchen counter. I was reinstated, fully, with an apology from my supervisor. But the message had been sent. Richard could reach into my life from a distance and apply pressure in places I couldn't easily see. I called Claire. Document everything, she said. Every interaction, every date, every call. If he does anything else, we add it to the civil action. What's the update on the will contest? We've filed, she said. Gerald Marsh has been served. The hearing is in 11 weeks. 11 weeks. I sat down on the floor of my home office and put my head in my hands. 2 weeks later, Richard made his biggest move. He went after Emma. Emma called me at midnight, barely coherent. He says if I support you in court, she sobbed, he'll make sure I never see Mom again. He says Mom is on his side, and if I, Sarah, he was screaming at me. I've never heard him like that. Breathe, breathe. He says you're lying. He says Dad chose him and I need to accept it, and if I don't, I'm betraying the family. Sarah, I don't know what to believe. Part of me is so I love him. He's my brother, but what you've told me. Emma, I kept my voice as calm as I could make it. Has Richard ever, in your entire life, made a decision that wasn't first and foremost about what was good for Richard? Silence. No, she said softly. No, he hasn't. So when he says Dad chose him above everyone else, does that sound like Dad? Or does it sound like exactly the story that Richard needs you to believe? Another silence. Longer this time. I'm scared, Emma said finally. I know, me too. But Emma, I need to know you're with me. Not for me, for Dad. The longest pause of my life. And then Emma said, what do I need to do? ACT 7, the DARKESD point. I won't glamorize what the next few weeks felt like. It was exhausting in the specific, grinding way that only sustained stress can produce. The kind of tired that doesn't respond to sleep. I lost weight without trying. I snapped at David twice and then cried about it afterward. Lily, who was 6 at the time and perceptive in the way only children can be, climbed into my lap one evening and said, Mommy, are you sad about Grandpa? And I said, yes, baby, I am. Which was true, but incomplete. I was sad about Dad. But I was also terrified of losing. Because as the weeks wore on and the legal process ground forward, I began to understand just how well Richard had constructed his fortress. Gerald Marsh was not some sketchy back alley operator. He was a legitimately licensed attorney who had filed all the paperwork correctly, dotted every I, crossed every T the will was signed. The power of attorney was filed. The financial transfers, while ethically criminal in my view, had been executed through proper channels. What we had was circumstantial, compelling but circumstantial. Harold Finch's testimony, Dr. Patel's cooperation, Martin Hayes' account of the sudden removal, the shakiness of the signature, the timeline. It's a strong case, Claire told me, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that it's not strong enough. What does not strong enough mean? It means a judge looks at a signed document, looks at the counterarguments, and decides the evidence of undue influence doesn't meet the legal threshold to overturn the will. And then Richard keeps everything. I stared at the wall of my attorney's office for a long time. There has to be something else, I said. There might be, Claire said carefully. But Sarah, at this point, we've gone through everything you've been able to provide, unless something new surfaces. My phone buzzed in my bag. I glanced at it. Unknown number, a text message. I almost ignored it. But something made me look. The message read, Sarah, my name is Alina Voss. I was your father's mother's sister, your great-aunt. We've never met. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for many things. But there is something you need to know, and I can't keep it to myself any longer. Thomas didn't want this. He tried to stop it. Please call me. I looked up at Claire. My hands were very still. Something just surfaced, I said. ACT 8, Eleanor. Alina Voss was 81 years old and lived alone in a small house in a coastal town 4 hours north. I drove there the next day, alone. David offered to come. I told him I needed to do this one by myself. Alina answered the door before I could knock, like she'd been watching for me. She was a small woman, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with my father's nose, and a way of holding herself that reminded me so viscerally of him that for a moment I couldn't speak. She put her hand on my arm. You have his eyes, she said simply. She brought me inside, made tea, sat across from me at a small kitchen table covered in papers and photographs. Eleanor, I said, how did you find me? Martin Hayes, she said. He reached out to me after your father died. He'd heard I'd been in contact with Thomas in his final months. I blinked. Were you? I didn't know Dad was in touch with you. He wasn't for a very long time, she said. We had a falling out. Family business from long ago, I don't need to burden you with all of it. But he called me in June, out of the blue after years of silence. He said he needed someone outside the family, someone he could trust who Richard didn't know about. Every nerve in my body sharpened. He called you. He did. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. He told me what was happening, Sarah. He told me that Richard had been coming around constantly, bringing documents, telling him it was all for the family, for protection, for smart financial planning. He said at first it seemed reasonable. Richard was confident, knowledgeable, and Thomas wasn't feeling well. His mind was foggier than he wanted to admit. He signed some things he didn't fully understand. But then something changed, I said. Eleanor looked at me steadily. He found a document on the printer, one that hadn't been cleared from the queue. He didn't mean to see it, he was just trying to print something for himself. And what he saw, she paused. He called me that night, very distressed. He said he thought he'd been tricked. He said the will he'd signed was not the will he'd agreed to. I gripped the edge of the table. Eleanor, did he do anything about it? She reached across the table and picked up a large envelope that had been sitting beneath a stack of photographs. She held it out to me. He did, she said. He drove here himself in August, barely told Margaret where he was going. He spent 3 days here, and in those 3 days with a different lawyer, a woman named Agnes Tran who works out of Millfield, he did everything he could think of to put things right. I took the envelope with hands that were no longer steady at all. I looked at her. Eleanor, I whispered, what is in this envelope? Your father's real will, she said. Signed in August. Witnessed by Agnes Tran and 2 other individuals. Video recorded as well because Agnes insisted on it. She wanted there to be absolutely no question about Thomas's mental state or his clarity or his intentions. She placed her hand over mine. He knew he might not have long, she said quietly. He told me he wasn't feeling well. He said he needed to fix this before something happened. He was very clear, Sarah. Your father was very clear. He knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what he wanted. My eyes were burning. He talked about you, Eleanor said softly. He said you were the one who would figure it out, he said. Eleanor, if anything happens, Sarah will come looking. She's just like her grandfather. She follows the truth all the way to the end, no matter what it costs her. I pressed my hands flat on the table. And I cried. Right there in Eleanor Voss's small kitchen, with the sound of the ocean somewhere in the distance, I put my head down and I cried for my father, for the man who'd been afraid and sick and manipulated and had still found a way, still found his stubborn, quiet, loving way to reach across time and protect his family. Eleanor let me. She brought more tea. And when I was done, she put her hand on my back and said, he loved you very much, all 3 of you. He wanted you to know that. ACT 9, the document. Agnes Tran was exactly what Eleanor had described, methodical, precise, and deeply serious about what she'd been part of. Claire and I met her in her office in Millfield 2 days after my meeting with Eleanor, and what she showed us made Claire, the most composed attorney I've ever met, physically sit back in her chair. The August will, my father's real will, was a complete repudiation of everything Richard had constructed. In it, my father left the family home to my mother outright, in perpetuity, with no time limit, no conditions, no clauses that would ever require her to leave. The savings were to be split 3 ways equally among the 3 children, minus a specific allocation set aside for my mother's care and living expenses. The family land in the valley, the land that had been my grandfather's, was to remain in a family trust, managed jointly, never to be sold without unanimous agreement. And there was a letter, a separate document, handwritten, that my father had written himself and asked Agnes to include. Agnes handed it to me. I'll protect that letter by not reading every word aloud. But I'll tell you the part I need you to know. Toward the end, my father wrote, Richard is my son and I love him. But he stopped seeing me as his father sometime in the last few years and started seeing me as an asset. I don't believe he intended to be cruel. I believe he told himself he was helping. But I was present for every conversation, even when he thought I was foggy. I heard what he said to Karen when he thought I'd fallen asleep. I saw what was happening. I was frightened and I was ill and I made mistakes. But I am Thomas Mitchell. And I would like that to still mean something. I folded the letter. I looked at Claire. How do we proceed? I asked. We file the August will immediately, she said. The video recording is extraordinary. Agnes was right to insist on it. Your father on camera, clear-eyed, articulate, explaining in his own words that he was revoking any prior documents obtained under duress or without his informed consent, describing what had happened with Richard. She shook her head slowly. Sarah, this is not a close case anymore. This is decisive. What about Richard's document? The August will postdates the one Richard has. Exactly. A later valid, properly witnessed and recorded will supersedes an earlier one. Richard's will, the one he's been holding up, is dated June. Your father's real will is dated August the 9th. It came after. It supersedes. I exhaled. And Gerald Marsh. Claire looked at me carefully. Gerald Marsh has some significant problems coming his way. I've been in contact with the state bar. The evidence suggests he drafted and witnessed a document for a client whose competency was questionable, under circumstances that at minimum warrant serious investigation. And Richard. Richard may be facing criminal charges, Claire said quietly. Elder financial abuse, fraud, undue influence, forgery, potentially, given that we now have 2 documents with your father's signature that appear to differ meaningfully. I thought about my brother. I tried, for a moment, to find something like sympathy. I couldn't find it. Not yet. Maybe someday. But not yet. ACT 10, the hearing. I'll tell you something about courtrooms. They are nothing like they look on television. There's no dramatic music, no sudden gasping revelations that echo through a packed gallery. It's mostly paperwork, procedural language, long silences while a judge reads something. But the day the video recording of my father was played for the judge, the day the courtroom had to sit and watch Thomas Mitchell sit in Agnes Tran's Millfield office on August the 9th, look directly at the camera with clear eyes, and explain precisely what he wanted and precisely why. That was the closest thing to drama I've ever witnessed in a legal proceeding. My father was wearing the blue sweater I'd given him for Christmas 2 years earlier. He spoke slowly but clearly. He said his name. He confirmed the date. He confirmed his mental clarity and his physical state. And then, in his own words, he described what had happened over the previous months. He didn't rage. He wasn't bitter. He spoke about Richard the way a parent always speaks about a child who has disappointed them, with a sorrow that runs deeper than anger. Richard is a smart man, my father said on the video, and his voice was so exactly his that I had to press my hand to my mouth. He's worked hard his whole life, and I'm proud of him for that. But somewhere along the way, he started measuring everything, including me, by what it was worth to him. And I let it happen for too long because I loved him. But I love all my children. And what's being done is not right. This is my family. This is my life's work. And I am the one who decides what happens to it. The judge watched the entire recording. The judge read the August will. The judge reviewed Agnes Tran's affidavit, Harold Finch's statement, and the medical testimony from Dr. Patel regarding my father's cognitive state during the period the June will was signed. The hearing lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, the ruling came down. The June will was declared invalid. The August will, my father's real will, was recognized as the governing document of Thomas Mitchell's estate. Richard lost everything he'd taken. I was sitting in Claire's office when she called me with the ruling. I heard the words. I said thank you. I hung up. And then I sat very still in my car in the parking garage for about 20 minutes. It wasn't the triumphant feeling you might expect. It wasn't victory in the way that movies make you believe justice feels. It was quieter than that. It was more like the feeling of putting down something very heavy that you've been carrying for a long time. My arms were sore, but my hands were free. ACT 11, the aftermath. Richard was arrested 3 weeks after the ruling on charges of elder financial abuse and fraudulent misrepresentation. Gerald Marsh lost his license. 2 of the financial transfers made during the period of unauthorized power of attorney were reversed, and the money was returned to the estate. Karen, and I'll give her this, perhaps the only thing I'll ever give her, Karen cooperated with investigators. Fully. I don't know what arrangement she made, and I don't want to know. But her cooperation meant that the case against Richard was thorough and documented in ways it might not otherwise have been. Their marriage did not survive the year. My mother took the longest. That, I want to be honest about, because I think people underestimate how complicated a parent's grief and vulnerability can make them. My mother had been managed so carefully by Richard, so consistently presented with a version of events that cast me as the troublemaker, the drama starter, the ungrateful daughter who was trying to upend a family in mourning, that even when the ruling came down, even when the evidence was undeniable, she didn't immediately come back to me. She called me on a Sunday morning, 4 months after the hearing. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say the whole thing before you respond." "Okay," I said. "I knew," she said. I closed my eyes. "I didn't know the extent of it," she went on, her voice unsteady. "I didn't know about the altered documents. I didn't know about all of it, but I knew that Richard had been guiding things. I knew the will wasn't quite what your father had originally intended. And I let it happen, Sarah, because I was tired, because I was frightened, because Richard was there and you were asking hard questions and it was easier to believe him than to deal with what the truth meant." I didn't say anything. "I was a coward," my mother said. "I let him use me, and I let him use your father. And I told myself it was grief and medication and old age, but the truth is that I was simply a coward. And I am sorry. I am so deeply, deeply sorry." I pressed the phone against my ear. I thought about every holiday, every phone call, every time she deflected my questions or parroted Richard's words back to me with that empty, helpless look in her eyes. And I thought about my father, who had loved her for 32 years, who had made her the first beneficiary of everything he owned, who had driven 4 hours to fix what was being done, not just to his children, but to her. "Mom," I said, "I know. You know. I know you were scared. I know he's persuasive. I know that what you went through, losing Dad, being alone, having Richard right there every day, I know that made you vulnerable. I'm not dismissing any of that." A long silence. "But," she said softly. "But yes," I said, "you have to acknowledge it, not to me, to yourself." "I do," she said. "I do acknowledge it." Another silence. "Are you going to be able to forgive me?" she asked. I thought about my father in that blue sweater, sitting in that chair, looking at that camera. I thought about what he'd said at the end of that video, in the last 60 seconds that I had memorized word for word. He had looked directly at the lens and said, "Tell them I'm proud of them, all 3, even Richard. I know that might be hard to believe right now, but he's still my son. And I want them to look after each other when I'm gone. That's all I've ever wanted. That's what this is for." "Yes," I told my mother. "I'm going to forgive you. It's going to take time. But yes." She cried. I didn't. I'd already done my crying. I was ready to be done with crying and start doing something else. Emma was, in many ways, the easiest healing. She showed up at my house the day after the ruling with 2 bottles of wine and her pottery wheel in the back of her car. She'd been asked to leave the apartment she'd been sharing with a friend and needed a place to stay. And I let her in, and she stayed for 3 months. We argued exactly twice, about dishes. Both times we made up within 20 minutes. Emma got her share of the inheritance. She used part of it to finish her pottery apprenticeship and open a small studio space that she rents with 2 other artists. It's doing well. She's so happy there that it's almost painful to witness, the good kind of painful. She still doesn't talk about Richard much. Neither do I. The family land in the valley is still in trust. Mom lives in the house, her house, the house that is hers without conditions or clocks or expiration dates. I visit on Sundays when I can. We sit on the back porch the way we used to when Dad was alive. She makes lemonade. We don't always talk much. Sometimes we just sit there in the afternoon quiet and look at the garden and breathe. Last spring, I planted a rose bush where Dad used to sit to drink his morning coffee. Mom doesn't touch it. She just tends everything around it. I understand. Epilogue. People ask me sometimes, when I've told parts of this story, they ask, "Do you hate Richard?" And I sit with that question for a moment every time. Because the honest answer is complex. I was furious. For a long time, I was consumed by a rage so complete it felt like a second weather system inside my body. I was angry at Richard. I was angry at Karen. I was angry at Gerald Marsh. I was angry at everyone who had smiled at me across holiday tables and Christmas trees and called it family while quietly constructing my erasure. But rage like that is expensive. It costs you things you don't realize you're spending. What I feel now, on my best days, is something more like grief, because Richard wasn't always the person he became. I remember him at 12, teaching me how to ride a bike. I remember him at my wedding, crying when he thought nobody was watching. I remember the way he'd call Dad on his birthday every year, always, without fail, and the two of them would be on the phone for an hour. Somewhere in there was a person I loved. Greed got him. Fear got him. The relentless pressure of wanting more, of seeing himself as the most important person in every room, of believing that the world owed him, and that family was a resource to be managed rather than a bond to be honored, that got him. And here's what I know now, on the other side of all of it. My father was right. Not just about what he wanted for his estate, about everything. He was right that the truth matters. He was right that even when your hands are shaking and your eyes are tired and you're frightened and alone, you still owe it to yourself and the people you love to be honest, to put the real thing down on paper, to trust that it will find its way. My father drove 4 hours to set the record straight. He sat in front of a camera and told the truth. And that truth survived him. It found me. It did exactly what he needed it to do. I like to think that if he could see where we are now, Mom in her house, Emma in her studio, David and Lily and me in our ordinary, imperfect, deeply loved life, I like to think he'd sit back in that blue sweater and put his hand around a cup of tea and say, "Good. That's exactly how it was supposed to go." And I'd say, "Yeah, Dad, it took a while, but we got there." If this story moved you, if you've ever been in a family that tested your belief in what's right, then you already know that the truth has a way of finding its way home. It doesn't always come fast. It doesn't always come easy, but it comes. Don't stop looking for it. And don't stop fighting for the people you love, even when you're tired, especially when you're tired. This is the kind of story we tell here every single week. Real, human, emotional, and always with the belief that doing the right thing is worth the cost. If this is your first time finding us, welcome. And if you've been here before, you know what to do. Subscribe to Late Night Stories and come back, because we're just getting started.